Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. El-Badawi, for having inviting me to participate in this session, and thank you for having me participating in your session. So just to put things in perspective, I always like to start a talk by giving the story how this talk came out. So Dr. El-Badawi contacted me last fall to talk about subsidy reforms in Egypt. And my answer was, I'm not an expert of subsidy reform in Egypt. However, I'm an expert of tax and subsidy reform. I've published extensively in that field. So I said, if you're interested, I can do something technical on subsidy reform. And then he said, have a look at Egypt and have a look and try to introduce one or two examples. And actually, I was surprised because by reading, it's exciting what is happening. And I think it's a very important topic, and I'm looking forward to learn also from my colleague here in the front. So it's just to put the perspective of my expertise concerning the talk that I will give. Assume that a policymaker wants to reduce inequality. And why would we like to reduce inequality? Essentially, there are many reasons. Equity is valuable in itself. Inequality, as we have seen in the last few days, may have impact on growth. With high level of inequality, it is known now has negative impact on growth. And also, the shape of the income distribution may be linked with social stability of a political system. So, of course, a policymaker is interested in stability of the system. So for all these reasons, a policymaker may be interested in using policy instruments to reduce inequality. So what are the channels that a policymaker may use? So the policymaker may use direct taxation. This is taxation of income, and transfers, means-tested program. He may use policies aiming at reducing, and this is very important, inequality of opportunities, policies in education, in health, reduction of gender disparities, ethnic disparities, sectarian disparities, and of course, he can complement all that using indirect taxation and subsidies. This is taxation or subsidies of consumption goods. As an economist, we know that each channel will have its benefit and its efficiency cost, and a well-balanced policy consists of using wisely all these policy instruments. Now, if we come to the Mena region, things are a little bit different. And people have mentioned it in this conference before. Consumption subsidies have been for years part of the social contract in the Mena region, and heavy reliance on this channel of redistribution may be explained by historical and institutional constraint and probably political reason, as it was explained this morning. So according to these co-authors, Stradovic, if I pronounce it well, and his co-author, Mena countries in 2011, so it's not so long ago, spent $237 billion in consumption subsidies. So this is 8.6% of the region total GDP, 48% of all world subsidies. So this is a big number. So it means that all the subsidies that are paid in the world, half of it is paid in the Mena countries. It represents 22% of government spending in the region. It's a huge chunk. And these numbers were on the rise in the following years. So the importance and the magnitude of these redistributive, and I'm putting redistributive in quotation mark, as you will see after, program motivated some economists to push for their reform. So what I'm planning to do in the last few minutes, and I will flash some of the slides, I will present intuitively the idea underlying a technical framework developed for marginal indirect and tax subsidy reform, part by Shlomo Yitzhaki and his co-author, and part from my co-author and myself. I will use this framework to brainstorm about actual subsidies reform in Egypt and use some information on quintile shares and subsidy available in the Stradovic and co-author paper. This information is based on survey from the pre-reform period, and this is useful when you want to think of the reform. Was it going in the right direction? And I also use pre-reform information on income quintile for Egypt that is available on the World Bank Open Data website. So I'm going in the wrong direction. Okay, so the analytical framework. So what is the main question we're trying to answer? So what is the impact of a tax or a subsidy reform on the well-being of the population? And there are three important measurement issues that is faced by the analysts when trying to answer this question. And the main objective of my presentation today is to show how we can circumscribe these issues. The first measurement difficulty is to estimate the impact of a price change, because we're talking about a change in the consumer price on the consumer welfare. So this will be linked with so the result may be linked and contingent to the econometric model that you are using. And the task will be very problematic when you are trying to find a globally optimal tax system. But globally optimal tax system is good in theory. In practice, people rarely look for that. So here I'm quoting Woodrow Wilson, who said, "We shall deal with our economic system as it is, and as it may be modified, not as it might be if we had a clean sheet of paper to write upon. And step by step, we shall make it what we want it to be, or what it should be." So the solution that we adopt is to focus on the effect of marginal subsidy and tax reform. So we're looking for direction, in which direction we are supposed to go. On this, I'm quoting Martin Feldstein, that optimal tax reform must take its starting point from the existing tax system. So the tax system is a departure point. The advantage of doing this is that evaluating the distributive impact of a marginal subsidy reform does not require estimates of demands. It only requires information on the amount that is spent on each one of the goods directly from the data set, if a data set is available. Second measurement issues, once we know the impact of a price change on someone's well-being, then we need to aggregate all this in a social evaluation function. And then there is a normative choice. What is the right social evaluation function that we should use? Santoro, in his review of the literature that he published in 2007, says that there are three main paths in the literature on the tax reform, and I love the guy, and you will see why. The first path is following Ahmed and Stern, and it aims at identifying socially improving tax reform for a very specific social welfare function. The second path, that Santoro calls the Daltonian school, builds on the work of Yitzhaki and Slemrod, and it aims at identifying tax reform that will be deemed socially desirable by all inequality-averse social evaluation function. And the third part builds on work that I've done with my co-author, Quentin Baudon, and analyzes marginal tax reform as poverty-reducing policies. Since the choice of a social welfare function embodies a value judgment, my favorite strategy is to use a class of social evaluation function instead of a specific one. So I like the two last part of the literature. In fact, even if Santoro consider Makdissi and Wadon as another path, I consider this as an extension of Yitzhaki and Slemrod. It's the idea of choosing a wide class of social evaluation function instead of a specific one. There are two types of approach. So one is to use social evaluation function that is rank dependent. This is the Yitzhaki and Slemrod approach. And the other type of approach is income dependent social evaluation function. Then the literature has evolved. With Stéphane Mussat, we offer a general framework for all rank-dependent ethical principle in a work that we have done with Jean-Yves Duclos and Quentin Wadon. We offer a general framework for tax reform under income-dependent ethical principle. And importantly, if one is interested in reform that will reduce or increase government revenue, a paper that I've published with Jean-Yves Duclos and Abdelkrim Ara looks at pro-poor objectives. So you're changing a policy, you're reducing the well-being or increasing the well-being of everyone, but you want to do this in a pro-poor or inclusive framework. Last measurement issues. Estimation of the impact of the tax reform on government revenue. This is also linked to the econometric model that we want to use. But there is a methodology that allows us to circumscribe that in Duclos, Makdissi, and Modon. I will show it quickly at the end of my presentation, the idea of how it works. So essentially, I will skip one slide. Essentially, how does it work? So we have, for each type of social evaluation function with a set of ethical principles, we have a consumption dominance curve that is linked to the level of income if we're thinking of income-dependent social evaluation function, or a concentration curve of order S if we are thinking in terms of rank-dependent social welfare function. What we're looking at non-intersection of two curves. So if one curve is above the other one, then you may reduce the subsidy on the lower curve and increase the subsidy on the higher curve, and this will increase social welfare for any social evaluation function. And there is a small parameter that you can see here. This is not working, so I don't have the pointer. The gamma that is in front of the second one. This takes into account the efficiency impact of the reform. I will come back to this in a few minutes. Now, let's use that. Let's use this technique and look at what happened in Egypt. So Egypt, for those of you who are not Egyptian, is a lower middle income country in the World Bank classification. In 2012, it started increasing the gasoline price. In 2013, electricity price increased by 16%, so gas and electricity has increased. Just to give you an idea, the cost of fuel subsidy in Egypt from 2002 to 2013, before this reform, rose from 9 to 22%. In 2013, spending on fuel subsidies by the Egyptian government represented 7% of GDP, and households receive only 17% of that. To put this in perspective, combined spending on health and education, this should be major spending of a government, represented 5% of GDP, food subsidy 2% of GDP. In 2014, there were additional reform, increase in the price of all fuel except liquefied petroleum gas. 53% of the savings were allocated, and this is the idea of the reform, increasing the price on something and putting part of it, at least, on other things, on social protection programs, and you have a list here. For the sake of time, I will skip this. And then you have a list of reforms that have happened recently, thanks to my colleague here. I have the information. I won't go over this, but it's essentially introduction of VAT on all goods, reduction of subsidy on fuels, capital gain tax freeze. I'm not sure this is the right thing to do if you want to reduce inequality, but then all the other things seems to go in the right direction. And at the same time, there was some increase in social protection program. You have the information on the slide here. And thanks to Google, it seems that they have also planned to increase the price on fuel again. So if you look, I took some tables from some papers that I've read. So if you look at fuel subsidies, here it's for the Mena region, but Egypt appears on this. You see that if you take the red line, this is it's at 40%, so they look what share of total subsidies go to the 40% poorest in the population, and of course for fuel subsidy it's everywhere below. For food subsidy, the story is a bit different. But even if they get less than their share of the population in terms of subsidy, this doesn't mean that the subsidy is regressive. It can be progressive if it is still above the Lorenz curve of income. So this is a graph that I took from a paper from Banerjee, Dr. Laiti, and some co-authors, and it represents the distribution of fuel subsidy in Egypt, and they do the appropriate thing. They draw the Lorenz curve, and they compare this to the Lorenz curve. And if you look at fuel subsidies such as, I want to make sure I'm not making any mistake, gasoline, diesel, or natural gas, it's all below the Lorenz curve. This means that if you cut this subsidy and put them to zero, you're reducing inequality. Doesn't mean that you're increasing the poor's welfare, because the price increased for the poor also, so you need some kind of compensation, but it actually reduces inequality. So if part of the proceeds is used to increase something else, then you're going in the right direction. Now, let's compare this with food subsidy. I drew this graph using only information on quintiles, so it's a very rough estimate. So here you have the subsidies on food, and you also have the subsidy on liquefied petroleum gas. Why? Because liquefied petroleum gas here is the green line, so it's the most redistributive fuel subsidy. We compare this with subsidies on food, and what do we realize is that if we look I want to make sure all food subsidies are progressive. They're all above the Lorenz curve. Bread is less progressive than liquefied petroleum gas, but sugar and wheat is more progressive than liquefied petroleum gas, and the sugar subsidy is actually pro-poor. So let's now turn, and it will be the last thing I will do because for a matter of saving time, let's look at the efficiency cost of the reform. So if we want to move from where we stand now, let's use the graph that we had now. And remember, how should we use this? We should compare the two concentration curves, but we should adjust by an efficiency ratio, the gamma parameter that was on my slide. What is the actual value of this gamma parameter? So on this slide, I have an exercise. We have done it from Mexico. Sorry, I've worked on other countries' data. We computed the value of the gamma parameter. So the first column is a column for food, and the other column for other goods. So the gamma parameters would take value, if you look at these tables, between 1.06 and 1.2. What we want to do is not to estimate directly the gamma parameter, but use the Duclos, Makdissi, and Woodon framework to use an interval for this gamma parameter. The math is here. Oh, I still have 5 minutes, okay. So I was rushing too much. I wanted to save time for my colleagues. Sorry, I got lost. So instead of finding a very specific value for this gamma parameter, we estimate interval for the gamma parameter using this equation here. So we were essentially rewriting the condition on socially improving tax reform in a way that the gamma parameter appears on one side of the equation, and then it gives us the redistributive benefit of the reform on the left and the efficiency cost on the right, and then we can find an interval for which the tax reform will be socially improving. I've done the exercise. I said, what if we increase the tax on liquefied petroleum gas and we use part of the proceeds to subsidize wheat? Quotient, this is not real estimates. I've used quintile information, so this is a theoretical exercise based on some real data information. So if you look at the lowest 20%, you can increase the tax on, or reduce the subsidy on LPG, and even if you're using only a small portion of the proceed to increase the subsidy on wheat, you will still be increasing the well-being of this part of the population. You can lose up to 147%. So in terms of efficiency. For the lowest 40%, 91% in terms of efficiency. And remember, the parameters that we got in Mexico are between 0 and between 1 and 1.2. For the bottom 60, you can go up to 51%. And for the lowest 80% of the population, so the big chunk of the population, you can lose up to 23% in efficiency, and it will still be socially improving. What does it mean? It means that you have some room to increase the tax and save part of the proceed, not only just efficiency, but part of the proceed to reduce public debt. And if you reinvest in a wise way, you can still improve well-being of 80% of the population. I've done the same exercise for a few others, but it's just a theoretical exercise. You can do the same thing with bread and wheat and sugar and wheat, and you have a different value of the parameter. In conclusion, there was, and there is still room for socially improving marginal subsidy reform in Egypt. If one refers to Vermeer and Arar, 2017, it seems that it is the case in all the region. Here I will be cautious we may reduce inequality, but by reducing inequality, increase polarization. And this is probably something you don't want to do. We can reduce inequality by reducing the purchasing power of the middle class to the poor. This is redistributive, but then you're increasing polarization. With Stéphane Mussard, we have a paper on polarization and tax reform. I strongly believe, and most economists believe, that the redistribution in this region should start moving towards more means-tested program and direct taxation and transfer. This requires a real desire to tax the economic elite of the country, or of the countries. In crony capitalism, you earn money by extracting rent. Taxing rent is efficient, so tax that. Make sure that means tests are performed with low level of corruption, investing and increasing investment in policy aiming at increasing equality of opportunities, education, health, and affirmative action for women in all dimensions. Implement program evaluation based on data to have evidence-based policy and consider the overall distribution of income. And this concludes my talk.